Hello, all. Welcome to the Symposium on Advancing Equity in Higher Education on Long Island. I am the moderator for this session on campus climate. My name is Katarina Reed, and I'm from Stony Brook University. My pronouns are she, her. Before our presentations begin, we will be sharing some quick announcements and housekeeping matters, just as we did with the keynote. First, you will notice two options on your screen, a chat and a Q&A tool. As your moderator, I will monitor both throughout the session, but we'll save all questions for the end. Questions are welcome via the Q&A tool throughout the presentation. And again, we will be using a strategy called progressive stacking. This is a technique intended to give marginalized voices a chance to speak, particularly in an environment where there is a dominant group. What this means is if you choose to self-identify as belonging to a marginalized group, especially a marginalized racial or ethnic group, and you'd like to ask a question or make a comment in the chat, you can choose to include an asterisk at the start of your chat. As your moderator, I will compile questions and comments throughout the session, and will prioritize those with an asterisk. You are not required to self-identify, it is an option. We will do our best to get through all the questions in the chat and Q&A. You can also chat to the panelists to get help with any technical issues and use the chat for conversation among attendees. Second, we are dedicated to providing a symposium experience that is free from all forms of harassment and inclusive of all people. Please be respectful of presenter and attendee experiences when participating in this session. This session is being recorded and will be available after the presentation on the SBU Libraries YouTube channel. Please be aware that chat transcripts will be captured by Zoom during recorded sessions. Thank you again all for joining. I will now turn to our presenters. First, we have Susan Wood from Suffolk County Community College, here to present on creating a custom LGBTQ+ ally training program for college employees, Braver Spaces at Suffolk County Community College. Followed by Marissa Petrusky from Stony Brook University, presenting on an analysis of academic culture and its impact on young professionals. Last but not least, we have Dina Spanos from Stony Brook University as well, here to present on perceptions of racism within SBU's School of Social Welfare. Without further ado, I will turn things over to Susan Wood. Susan Wood is an instruction librarian and associate professor at Suffolk County Community College on Long Island. She holds master's degrees in women's studies and library science. She is currently serving as a chair of the Suffolk County Community College LGBTQ+ Task Force and the Braver Spaces LGBTQ+ Ally Training for College Employees program. She is an active member of the American Library Association's Rainbow Roundtable and the Association of College and Research Libraries Women and Gender Studies section. Her professional interests include critical information literacy education and social justice programming. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you for that introduction, Katarina. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. So what I want to do with my 15 minutes is to share the process of creating an LGBTQ ally training program for college employees. And I'm going to be doing that by talking about the process that we went through at Suffolk. And what I'm really hoping is that this information is going to be useful to anyone who would maybe be considering developing this kind of custom training at their own college. So at Suffolk in 2016, the newly formed LGBTQ+ Task Force, it was founded by two Suffolk faculty members, Deborah Provenzano from the libraries and Dante Morelli from the communications department. And initially they identified the need for an LGBTQ ally training program for college employees, and they tasked a working group, which I was a member of, with developing this kind of a program. We came up with a curriculum, and then with the support of Student Affairs, we developed a 6-hour, 2-part professional developed seminar for Suffolk employees, faculty, staff, and administrators. Now, we've since offered the Braver Spaces training 3 times on each of the 3 main campuses, and we have 75 employees from all different departments who have completed. And each semester we have a waiting list. So part of this is that we need to figure out how to scale up from here. We try to keep the program with just a small number of people, 25 at a time, just to make sure that there's space for conversation and questions around really sensitive issues that people might be really thinking about deeply for the first time and reflecting on their own identities. And we also think that this training is most effective in person. So we decided to put a pin in it last March due to the pandemic. So we haven't offered the training for 3 semesters. The task force itself has pivoted to providing some online virtual training and programming. So we've been doing that, but we're really looking forward to getting back to campus so that we can bring everyone together again for this type of programming. So first of all, what is allyship? Here are 2 quotes that I like. Allyship just basically refers to the idea that we can each support the need of others. And often this goes across identities. So we're supporting people whose identities differ from our own in very key ways. Now, allies are often, but not always, those who occupy a space of privilege due to some aspect of their identities. And then you can use that privilege to advocate with and amplify the voices of others with marginalized identities. Another way to think about allyship is that it's really important to decenter yourself as the ally. It's about the community of people that you're supporting. And I like this quote from Dara Hoffman Fox, where here she says, it's about shutting up, showing up, educating yourself, and not taking up space with your privilege. So a key aspect of effective allyship is to seek out the voices of marginalized people and humbly listen to what they have to say. And I want to emphasize that you're listening from a humble perspective as a learner. But at the same time, you need to be careful not to place the burden of education on the people that you would like to help. So Braver Spaces at Suffolk, it's based on the foundation of education. And that means the idea that it's a crucial step for aspiring allies to have significant, meaningful, and guided opportunities for learning and for growth, and then to fill in those gaps of knowledge that we each develop from the experiences of heteronormative and binary and cisgender privilege. So allyship has a direct impact on climate. Campus Pride Index, which you may have heard of, this is a source of information about climate for LGBTQ communities on specific college campuses. And some of the indicators used to measure climate are here. Specifically, the support and institutional commitment indicator is measured in part by whether or not your college has existing ongoing ally training programs and a visible network of openly identified allies. And so that is really what we set out to create. So how did we get started with this? I'd like to say it was just really smooth sailing and straightforward, and that we just started at point A and ended up with a finished program. But of course, nothing with impact is ever developed in that way. So there were some false starts, and there was a real discursive process of communication. The first thing we did was that the LGBTQ Task Force brought in some one-off allyship training opportunities. These were used to explore what this training might look like and also to measure the general interest on the topic. And both of these were extremely well attended by employees, and people clearly wanted more. So it was decided at that time that we would create a custom program in order to take the best of what we were seeing and adapt it to our environment. There was also initially release time granted to a counselor specialist on the task force to start working up a curriculum and a plan. And while that didn't bring it to fruition, it really generated some ideas and some places to start the conversation. And it really showed how complex what we were trying to do was. Lots and lots of meetings. I can think about the meeting as aligning our visions. Sometimes it felt like we were spinning our wheels a little bit, but I think this is all really a necessary part of coming to some kind of consensus about our vision for what this ally training program would look like. So some of the issues we debated included how much time we could reasonably expect employees to devote to attending the training, what we should call it, what the learning objectives and outcomes should be. And there was in particular a lot of back and forth over what constitutes quote unquote the basics of LGBTQ plus allyship training. We had differing visions of what these basics might be, but it was one of those moments where people are not recognizing certain assumptions that you may have, and we were all in that mode. And so it took a lot of conversation to really tease out really what we were trying to do. So what really pulled this all together were 3 things. The first thing is that we clarified the learning outcomes. So we thought about what do we want people who have completed this training to be able to do. And so you can see some of our learning outcomes here. Importantly, learning to recognize and challenge prejudice and discrimination based on heterosexist norms. And then really one of my most important learning outcomes here is the idea that you need to recognize the need for ongoing learning and seeking out opportunities to learn. Now, we also developed an optional contract for people who have completed the Braver Spaces program to sign, and it's a symbolic commitment to allyship, and it includes these learning outcomes. The contract also stipulates that Braver Spaces allies will seek out further professional development opportunities, and the LGBTQ Task Force has continued to bring in programming to support this ongoing professional development, including speakers and film screenings. And over the pandemic, we've done a couple of virtual book discussions, so that's been great. Now, a lot of the details of the structure of the program, like the ally contract and the ideas for identifying swag, which I'll show you in a moment, they came from Suffolk's Title IX Officer and Chief Diversity Coordinator, Chris Vargas, and also from our interim Assistant Vice President of Student Affairs, Patty Munch. They were two administrators who were very instrumental, and they both serve on the LGBTQ Task Force. Chris in particular brought a lot of experience and knowledge to the process because she was instrumental in creating the LGBTQ Ally program at Stony Brook. So the second part that came together was, if you're going to have learning outcomes, you need to have learning objectives. And so we started talking about what these learning objectives might be. And this is where I drew on my background in women's and gender studies. And I thought about using the threshold concepts. So a threshold concept is simply a key concept that once grasped, it serves as a building block for developing new ways of seeing, and importantly, for unlearning old ways of seeing. So it's transformational. Each academic field of study will have threshold concepts, and they're transformative. So they transform a learner's perspective and then provide an avenue for leaving behind old ways of thinking and thinking about new worldviews. So these are some of the, as I think of them, conceptual nuggets underlying threshold concepts for women's and gender studies. And what we did was I worked on breaking those out into how would we expand on those to specifically focus on LGBTQ allyship. So for example, the sex, gender system, and social construction piece from women's and gender studies became examining heteronormativity, stereotypes, and pervasive gender socialization that begins before birth, and where the women's and gender studies conceptual nugget focuses on privilege, we broke that out into hetero, binary, and cis privilege. So we sort of expanded on the basic threshold concepts of the women's and gender studies. Now, a really important part of the Braver Spaces training is also to think about yourself as the starting point, and we encourage everybody to do that with some activities that kicks off our training. So everyone has a sexual identity, everyone has a gender identity, and everyone makes choices about gender expression. So if you start with a critical examination of how you have experienced the sex gender system and gender socialization, then it helps you to understand how other people who may be different from you have experienced the same system, but in very different ways. And then the third really crucial piece was that we got a grant. So this was a grant that was written by the LGBTQ Task Force. Specifically, Chris Vargas and Patty Munch had a lot to do with this. And the funds from this grant were used for our swag. So we wanted to create a visible network of people who had gone through this training. So we had stickers made. These go on doors, windows, cubicles, flash drives with our logo. And by the way, the logo was designed by one of our students. I loaded up the flash drive with a bunch of extra materials, instructional materials for people to continue to pursue. And then we have the lapel pins. And I have to say, it's incredibly gratifying to be at meetings or gatherings or walking around campus and seeing these stickers and seeing people sporting their lapel pins. It really does make that visible difference. So administration of Braver Spaces is something that I'm kind of doing on my own right now. If you're going to be starting this kind of a program, this is something you need to think about. These are some of the things that need to be handled for administration. The way that I work all of this into my work life is that I consider it really part of my service commitment and my responsibility to the college. And I'm really lucky to have the flexibility with my work to make room for really meaningful service opportunities. At Suffolk, we have a really strong culture of service to the community. It's very important for faculty and staff to contribute to serving our community. And we also have a very strong culture of faculty-led professional development. So the time needed to facilitate Braver Spaces and do some of this administrative work is fortunately something that I have to give at this point in time. I want to speak about assessment specifically, because assessment's crucial if you want to demonstrate the impact and justify the continuation of your program. So far, we've been doing pre-post testing and getting general feedback from participants. And we also created a testimonial video for people who had gone through the training, and we put that on our website. We use an indirect self-measure of familiarity with selected learning objectives. The pre-test is bundled with the online registration for Braver Spaces, so we get 100% participation on the pre-test, but the post-test is delivered via email after the program, so we have slightly less participation. We're looking at the pre and post in the aggregate to see if we've managed to move the needle, but one thing that we're running into as a problem is that a lot of people are setting themselves up with 5s on the pretest, indicating that they're already very familiar. Now, when we go through the training and the conversation, we see learning is happening, and we see that some people might not actually be at a 5. But what happens then is they don't have anywhere to go on the post-test to indicate if they increased their knowledge. We could fix that by switching to a direct or objective measure of familiarity with learning objectives, but we haven't made that switch yet. And we also could probably get more post-test participation if we did it immediately after the program while people are still gathered together. But I honestly don't think that after 3 hours of kind of intense self-reflection and talking about really tricky issues is a great time to ask people for meaningful feedback. You know, you're kind of done at that point. There's a sense of completion that sets in. So that's something, the assessment, that we'll really need to work on to figure out how we can really show the impact that this program is having. So scaling up and future directions, we need more facilitators. So initially, when we started Braver Spaces, I was co-facilitating with a specialist in the counseling department, and we were providing the training just once a semester. And what we'd really like to be able to do, because the demand seems to be there, is to offer the training once or maybe even twice a semester on each of our 3 main campuses, Brentwood, Selden, and Riverhead. We've definitely seen the demand, but that takes more facilitators. We've recruited more facilitators, and they're wonderful, and they had started presenting, but then the pandemic really stopped everything, so we didn't really get rolling with that. Now, we'd also really like to have a very diverse group of facilitators, not just because representation matters, but because it's useful for participants in the program to see partnerships with the co-facilitators that demonstrate allyship. So currently, all the facilitators are cisgender women, and we're either white or Latinx identified. What would be great is if we could have co-facilitators, maybe a cisgender woman and a trans woman, or we could have a lesbian and a straight cisgender man as co-facilitators. And this would be a concrete demonstration of what allyship looks like as we are teaching allyship. We do include diverse points of view in this training. I'm constantly on the lookout for what we can do with our training materials and activities to make sure that they're multicultural, to make sure that they reflect intersectionality. And it would be great to be able to do that with facilitators as well. We're also working on developing a Braver Spaces Ally training program for students. That's one of our next steps, and we will be leaning hard on probably our Center for Social Justice and Human Understanding staff and our campus activities and multicultural affairs staff, because they are the experts in developing student-led programming. And then, of course, it goes without saying that we need support with assessment and administrative tasks as we grow. So here's a brief checklist. This is what you would need to get started. I want to point out just 2 of these. Administrative support's crucial. They can help with finances, with communications, with advertising, with space, and they also, can be great cheerleaders for the program. Partnerships are also important. Now at Suffolk, we don't have an LGBTQ resource center or a queer studies program, but we do have a women's studies program. So, look around your campus and you may find that there are many partners to help get something like this started. And whether the home is going to be your LGBTQ resource center or a task force just depends on what it's like. So I'm out of time. That's what I will leave you with. And I'm looking forward to any questions or comments that you may have at the end of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Next, we have Marissa Petruski. She is a graduating senior physics major from the Women in Science and Engineering Honors College, also known as WISE, at Stony Brook University. As a former WISE first-year student mentor and the current vice president of the Society of Physics Students, she draws from the experiences of herself and her peers to devise and lead initiatives that promote a healthier and more inclusive culture in STEM. She has previously been awarded the Stony Brook Undergraduate Recognition Award for Outstanding Achievement in Community Service and recently won the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. Congratulations, Marissa, and welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Is my screen share doing it correctly?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, thanks so much. Great, so have you been awake? What have you been doing all week? These words were scribbled in red across the bottom of my failed quiz. I almost didn't believe it was real at first. This was a professor who made jokes in class, who gave great explanations during office hours, who was loved by their students. So how could someone like that write something so callous and dismissive towards a student that was doing their best and evidently struggling? I've had a long time since then to think about the answer to that question. I don't think it was written with the express intent to hurt me. It reads more like a passing thought, perhaps a way of venting that students weren't getting it in spite of their efforts. I think they also heard that kind of harsh dialogue throughout their career, to the point where they can't tell what's rude anymore. And I know that quiz comments and grades should not be taken as evaluations of my worth as a student and future professional, even if they're what's most immediately accessible. All of these answers trace back to the same source, academic culture. If I had known these sort of experiences happen to everyone, if I had known it was reflective of a wider issue, if I had known I could still make it to where I am today, no matter how stacked the odds were against me, then maybe I wouldn't have been so quick to point to myself as the problem. Now, I call this an analysis of academic culture, but in reality, that's a very tall order for a 15-minute talk. Academic culture is as diverse as the fields within it, which is a part of what makes it so difficult to address all the issues at once. I'll do my best to be as general as possible, but fair warning, some of my words and examples are going to be geared towards those pursuing research in STEM, since that's what I'm most familiar with. With that said, none of what I'm about to say is meant to call out any specific person, department, or institution unless mentioned by name. To start, one common thread that unites all of Western academia is the value placed on objectivity. Truth must be true regardless of circumstance and personal bias. And the way we check that is to constantly question what we hear. Experiments must be retested, theories must consider more cases, and new ideas must be verified against or correctly refute already accepted ideas. Or, in the words of Patricia Hill Collins, the arguments that can withstand the greatest assault and survive intact become the strongest truths. It's understandable at times why this attitude is needed, especially in STEM. If I want to develop a vaccine, I can't allow myself to be swayed by small test groups of success. I want my work to be questioned and tested again and again so that the vaccine can be the best and safest it can be. But this attitude inevitably sets up an adversarial relationship between those with academic power and those without it, where the latter must constantly prove their ideas and work have value, thus proving they themselves have value. Undergraduates are most vulnerable to this as is, so when our objective approach to research manifests throughout our education structures and early career opportunities, we end up pushing away the very people we are trying to train. What do I mean by that? Well, if our arguments have to survive endless questioning and testing, why shouldn't our students? This is what we call the sink or swim approach to higher education. Most academic programs are built with the expectation that some students will just fall through the cracks. It's the idea that only the strong will survive, and so no matter what you throw at them, if they're meant to stay in the major, they can take it. The problem is it's always the same type of students that fall through the cracks. First generation, low socioeconomic status, underrepresented. Some examples are obvious, like weed-out classes designed to be ridiculously difficult or just exhausting to thin out a major early on. Or teaching to the highest caliber, where a professor either teaches assuming all students have a very strong understanding of background material, which they probably don't, or they attempt to improve by the curriculum by teaching way more content than should be expected, putting already struggling students at an even worse disadvantage. But other examples are more subtle. A lack of funded undergraduate career opportunities means some students must choose between working at Starbucks or getting crucial experience in a research project in their field. Another big one is lack of tailored advising outside of a student's department. Now, student support resources are stretched thin at most schools, especially in these times. So I definitely do not blame a general academic advisor for not knowing what to say when I say, should I be taking advanced linear algebra before or with quantum mechanics? Or how I can support my family while going to graduate school. But if I don't get the support I need from that advisor, that likely means I just have to figure it out on my own, especially if my own department has many of the issues already discussed. It also creates distrust between the student and the university support resources, since I start to assume they just don't understand my situation and can't help me. These are just some examples of how our academic culture can negatively impact higher education on a structural level. More still can be said about how it impacts us on an interpersonal level. Being objective requires us to emotionally detach ourselves from our work so that we can engage in rigorous academic debate or assessments of progress without taking anything personally. But undergraduates just aren't prepared enough for that. All children get asked what they want to be when they grow up, to the point where it becomes a way of introducing ourselves. And if that answer deviates from the norm in the communities we're from, our career path becomes an immense source of pride for ourselves and the people that support us. That's why when a student fails an exam for the first time or gets bombarded with questions at their first presentation at a new job, or gets "have you been awake" written across the bottom of their quiz, they don't take it objectively. Doubts about our work feel like doubts about us and our ability to succeed, even if we're still in the process of building that basic foundation of knowledge. Ironically, most professors and professionals understand that mistakes are okay and that it takes time to feel confident in a field, especially when that level of testing is considered the norm. But without anyone explicitly saying that, students are either expected to persevere through it until they understand that it's a part of a culture, or are discouraged from the field entirely. This leads to a natural discussion about mental health. Perseverance is rightfully valued in higher education and academia, but the expectation to just persevere is interchangeable with workaholism. This has serious consequences for a student's relationship with their field of study. We've all heard the phrase, "do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life." That attitude gets used to justify excessive work habits. Again, if I'm some physics major and that's been my passion my whole life, now in a college level physics class doing homework till 3 a.m., I'm going to wonder why it's suddenly not as interesting. And if I don't find it interesting, should I even be doing it? We need to teach students to draw the line between passions and obligations. Additionally, no discussion of mental health and higher education would be complete without mention of imposter syndrome, defined as a psychological pattern where anyone, regardless of ranking, doubts their ability and worth despite evidence otherwise. What I'd like to emphasize is that when we talk about imposter syndrome, we don't frame it as a random condition that just happens to affect high-achieving individuals, especially underrepresented persons. It's directly perpetuated by, if not caused by, our current cultural climate. Let's look at how some of the things I attributed to imposter syndrome early on in my undergrad could have actually been explained by wider systemic issues. If I'm looking at my math grades and seeing that they're not great, that's not me blindly doubting myself. In reality, my math background just wasn't as strong as my peers. That's just a fact. Or if I'm feeling inadequate because my peers are understanding things faster than me, that's not my imagination, and it's not some syndrome. It's directly caused in part by some of my classes being taught with the sink or swim approach. Finally, if I'm feeling like I don't belong in physics, maybe it's because I'm not getting explicit validation otherwise. In this case, attributing my feelings to imposter syndrome was a disservice to myself. In recognizing the larger issues at play, I was able to better convince myself to keep going and feel inspired to take action about them throughout my career. Of course, These are only minor examples in the grand scheme of things, but bottom line, when we talk about imposter syndrome, we need to address the underlying cause behind it. Otherwise, it puts the burden on the individual to fix their thought processes while everything around them is telling them otherwise. With that said, where do we go from here? First and foremost, transparency is needed within academic culture and expectations. There's so much that we want to change and reform, but the fact of the matter is, this is the way things are right now. So the sooner we inform young professionals of it, the less likely they are to put the blame on themselves when they encounter it. The best part is, this isn't something that's difficult to do on a day-to-day basis. Simply acknowledging that a course or career is difficult can do wonders for a student's confidence, especially when it comes from those higher up. When one of my professors mentioned that it took him 3 whole courses to understand electricity and magnetism, it made me feel better when I was struggling with the material on my first course. Anecdotes like that correct student perceptions that success comes without struggle. To take it a step further, explicit expectations of positive feedback need to be encouraged. If I'm helping a student with a homework problem, I always try to tell them what they're doing or thinking correctly before I go into what they're doing wrong. Warm feedback is just as important as cold feedback because it lets students know what they should keep doing. Now, when it comes to enacting more systematic solutions, I highly encourage leaders to work with undergraduate and graduate organizations to figure out what students need. 2 years ago, the Stony Brook Career Center reached out to my organization, the Society of Physics Students, to ask why physics majors never show up to Career Center events. Now, to us, the answer was obvious. Most physics majors start out with tunnel vision on pursuing academia, but the Career Center primarily deals with industry. So we've been working together since then to figure out what kind of career events physics students will respond best to, what kind of questions they have about doing something outside academia. There's a renewed sense of trust there, one that has brought about great results for students. And in evaluating student experiences, we have to remember that anecdotes are data. Now that sounds contradictory to academic research, but building better cultural climates isn't an exact science, so we have to work with whatever information we have. The experiences of one reflect the experiences of many. Finally, it must be made explicitly clear that being sensitive to these issues does not detract from the quality of the institution, department, or research. Recognizing and addressing these issues doesn't make us weak, nor does it mean we've already failed. What matters is that we continue trying to do better. I ask you all to think about how academic culture manifests in your own work environment. There's even more nuance to be had with every department and field, and so we need everyone to best figure out how to address these issues in their own areas. Strategies I discussed today are not the end-all be-all, but if nothing else, I hope they get you talking. After all, as public institutions, we should be the ones leading this conversation.
Thank you so much, Marissa. We will be moving on now to Dina Spanos. She is a MSW student with a background in violence prevention, mental wellness, and anti-racist education. As a member of the School of Social Welfare's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Standing Committee and the Racial Equity Student Alliance, Dina is committed to advocating for racial justice in higher education from the micro to macro level. With a focus on decentering whiteness and social work, Dina is currently working on her final semester capstone project to decolonize social work education and utilize cultural humility as a tool for social change. In her free time, Dina hosts Getting Inclusive, a podcast she established through her organization Community Empowerment Services, which focuses on violence prevention through collective and systemic care. Welcome, Dina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. Okay. Can everyone see that? All right, I'm going to get started then. Hi, everyone. My name is Dina. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a final semester student, master's student at the School of Social Welfare at Stony Brook University. Today's presentation is on the perceptions of racism at Stony Brook University School of Social Welfare, presented by myself on behalf of some group work that I did in the fall semester of 2020 with my group mates Emily Carrillo, Carolina Guzman, and Angela Rizzo, who could not be here today, so I am kind of presenting on their behalf. So today I'm going to be presenting a part of a photo voice presentation, which I'll explain in a bit. But basically, this presentation was created and adapted for today with the target audience of really reaching Jacqueline Mondros and Richard Morgan, the deans of the School of Social Welfare, and all faculty and staff of the MSW and BSW programs at Stony Brook University School of Social Welfare. The goal that we had in mind was to create, to make the class that we did this for, the elective Anti-Racist Social Work, Understanding Black Rage and White Fragility, to become a foundational level course for incoming BSW juniors and a requirement for MSW first year students. So a little bit of background. The roots of social work are actually embedded in white supremacy. However, the profession is really seeking to achieve racial justice. White supremacy culture often shows up in social work education and social work practice in the form of guilt, silence, fragility, saviorism, and invulnerability. Invulnerability kind of talking about the reluctance for white students to really unpack their privilege. And finally, I think a really great leading question to go into this work is thinking about how can a field that participates in racist systems also work to dismantle those same systems, right? So today I'm going to walk you through what our process was in this group project. We did a bit of exploratory research through an anonymous student survey and also student interviews. And we later created a photo voice project. For those of you who are not familiar with photo voice is a really innovative way to reflect, talk about, learn, share, and make a difference for yourself and others through using photos. And it helps because we're trying to put the cameras in the hands of those with valuable lived experiences so they can explore and share their perspectives. And this is a really wonderful tool for social justice, collaborating for change, identifying needs. So that's why we chose this method. So this kind of is a breakdown of who participated in our survey. We sent out our survey to students in our classes and also through graduating Facebook groups. We had 40 responses from students of varying backgrounds. And so this was a representation of the responses to our question around identity, which we actually left pretty open-ended. And we just asked, how do you identify? And we said, you know, feel free to include race, ethnicity, gender, whatever you're comfortable with. And it ended up actually being a fairly accurate microcosm of the wider social work field, because as you can see, we have the majority of the folks filling this out were white females and also white males. And then in there we have mixed in Black identified individuals, Italian, multiracial, Hispanic. So we had kind of a good mix of student perspectives for this. So I'm going to walk you through some of the questions that were asked, and then at the end kind of move towards a call to action. So this question, the representation of this photo, stemmed from a question asking students to define racism with some words and phrases. So these are some of the words and phrases that came out of that. We have discrimination, systemic oppression, outward hate, prejudice, based on generalities and stereotypes, imbalance and equal rights. So this kind of helps the students to kind of lay the pavement to what was to come in the survey. This photo depicts students' responses to how racism impacts their daily lives, which I think you can see there is a breakdown between maybe white identified students and BIPOC students. So we do see that white identified students were fairly open to admitting their white privilege, and BIPOC students were expressing frustration about inequities and also mistrust of the police. So these were some of the more concerning responses. that we got in regards to really showing how white fragility is showing up at the School of Social Welfare. So one of the questions, have you observed and or experienced racism in the program? My advisor told me to grovel and admit my white privilege to gain favor with my Black supervisor. How do you interpret the term white fragility, anti-white racism? Have you observed white fragility within this program? Please explain. I have experienced other white people seeming to resist the idea of white privilege and become defensive about having to write about their inherent bias, claiming they have none. So these are pretty concrete examples of how white fragility is showing up in our social work education, and really specifically in our social work classrooms. Another question that we had, which stems from the title of our class, was how do you interpret the term Black rage? This was a major focus in the content of our class, which, if you're not familiar with, is really the amalgamation of centuries worth of oppression and trauma associated with systemic racism. So in our responses, we noticed that white students did not know the phrase at all and actually seemed to kind of tiptoe around its potential meaning, assuming that it was something inherently racist. One student did go as far as to answer that it was a PC term that justifies Black rioting and mostly peaceful protests, which was definitely a charged statement. And I think this really brought up the fact that I don't think professors are acknowledging Black rage. I think that they're not able to really speak to that in classrooms. So you know, if students are responding in that type of way, it's really important that we're using our classroom spaces to flesh that out. Many observations of racism were noted in the program, from professors giving their automatic vacuum cleaners, sometimes known as Roombas, names associated with Latinx folks such as Javier and Maria, to professors avoiding conversations around race and racism. It is clear that racism is embedded into the fabric of social work education. Here, one of the students noted that his observation of reverse racism and complaining about favoritism between Black students and administration. This really highlights the need to decolonize the field because white folks remain really blind to their own biases, yet feel comfortable you know, crying out reverse racism. There's really a lack of understanding, like a deep knowledge of what is racism and how is it showing up in our field. So one of the questions that we asked towards the end of the survey was, how hard is it to be an anti-racist anyway? So I really enjoyed this response, so I'll read it. Not racist means to choosing to not participate in and or deny the social construct of racism, which in my opinion is impossible. Race is a game baked into the United States mythos where all of us are participating in. Anti-racism is a practice of leaning into, responding to, and shifting actions, concepts of self, and other forms of socialized norms to actively and consciously undermine racism as a social construct. Social work really needs to continue to engage in racial justice work and anti-racist education. And we also really need to work towards liberation and abolition, not just reform. If we are continuing to participate in the systems that are hurting our clients, that are hurting vulnerable populations, we are not fulfilling our role as social workers, and we're not following the National Association of Social Workers ethics. So this was taken from one of the student interviews that we conducted. Actually, it was my group mate, Carolina, who conducted this one. And this is a quote taken from the interview. So one of the biggest challenges, this is in response to the question, what do you believe are the core challenges when it comes to racism in higher education? One of the biggest challenges is that people think it's gone. We saw this when Obama was elected and people started to think that having a Black president meant that racism doesn't exist anymore. A lack of acknowledgement of racism within our systems and society are stopping people from engaging with it and breaking it down. On top of that, a lot of people are opposed to change and don't want to do the hard work and the change that needs to happen in order to dismantle racism. I think this is a very common thought We do not live in a post-racial society, and our social work education really needs to reflect that, because otherwise we're going to just perpetuate that into the field after we graduate. Okay, this is the final question, and then we'll get to the kind of more action steps. So this question was, do you believe that the program properly addresses issues pertaining to racism, such as white privilege, white supremacy, and identity? So this student was really furthering the need to engage in abolitionist ideology and felt like the School of Social Welfare was really pushing more surface level changes. Change cannot happen from reading one book, and the program really needs to talk about what systemic change can look like and how we as social workers can be a part of that change. Okay, so this is kind of the shift into the photo voice piece, where we're trying, this was really geared at the deans of the School of Social Welfare, to try and really raise their awareness, like really build consciousness as to what the issue is. So here we're saying student leaders at the School of Social Welfare came together last summer to organize educational events for students after the murder of George Floyd. This was done in response to really inaction by the school. There was no type of like programming, no announcement really. There is some resources that were sent out, and that was about it. So students came together, myself included, to really try and make a change. The New York State National Association of Social Workers has also been hosting monthly town hall events to uplift the experiences of students of color in their BSW and MSW programs across the state. So here I'm asking, where are you, Jacqueline Mondros and Richard Morgan, the deans of the School of Social Welfare? Stony Brook undergraduate students are rallying for Black Lives. Where is the School of Social Welfare? And finally, it took the School of Social Welfare 5 months to put out a formal statement of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement after the murder of George Floyd. What took so long? And here we have kind of the conglomeration of all of the different suggestions for change that we came up with as our group within the social work program. So the first is a town hall prioritizing the voices of students of color to speak on their experiences in this program and add to suggestions for change. Every student should be required to read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi before starting the MSW and BSW program. We also suggested an implementation of a survey mid-semester to be distributed to all students focused on students' experiences with issues related to racism and discrimination, microaggressions in the classroom. Professors must be required to attend anti-racist classroom facilitation trainings annually. And finally, our social work curriculum must be taught through a critical race theory lens with an emphasis on cultural humility. These were just some of the recommendations for change. This is obviously a running list, and this is actually work that I'm continuing on this semester. And it's really important that in this work, it's not just being done or headed by white folks like myself. I acknowledge I'm a cisgender white woman. I benefit from white supremacy, so I cannot do this work alone, and I really shouldn't be leading in this work. This needs to be a collective effort with BIPOC students. And we can really see a shift in the social work profession. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dina. Thank you, all of you. I'm humbled to be moderating this session. Thank you so much again for sharing your work and experience. We have a few questions so far. First, there was a question about slides. We are collecting slides and we'll make them available with the recordings. This was specifically for Marissa's presentation, and she will be dropping the link in the chat. We also have a question for Susan Wood. First question, could you say more about the grant process, and do you have any tips for finding grants?
That's a great question, and I'm really not the best person to answer it. The grant was written by 2 members of our LGBTQ task force, and I apologize to any task force members who are logged into this who I may have overlooked. But finding grants is something that you have to go to people who've written a lot of grants and who know how to do that. If you just go to SUNY and look at what SUNY is offering, you'll find a lot of things. Talk to any offices of professional development, that will help. And then, of course, any professional organizations to which you belong are a great source of information for finding out about more grants. But yeah, just to make it clear, the grant writing process was something that I wasn't specifically involved with. We were all beneficiaries of that work that was done by other members of the task force.
Thank you, Susan. We'll switch over to Marissa. There's a question here for you. Do you think problems of representation tie into the topics you touched on?
Yes, absolutely. In particular, I encourage people to think about representation not as it applies to the surface level, which is racial or gender or things along those lines, but just in terms of background experience. Many professors come from backgrounds where they are very used to the academic elite culture. Their parents might have done PhDs or MS degrees or things of that extent. And so it's difficult to understand how you can picture yourself following a career path if everyone above you has taken such a different trajectory. So representation would absolutely improve some of that, being able to visualize success at a young age.
Thank you, Marissa. Another question, I believe, for Susan, but others can answer. Sometimes the community service aspect of this kind of work, similarly to all inclusion work, demonstrates a lack of administrative commitment by institutions. It creates a reliance on people who are directly impacted and personally invested in seeing change, and often creates burnout of the few historically marginalized folks on campus. It is unpaid, added work that is not just taxing on their own time and resources, but mentally and emotionally taxing. How can these volunteers advocate for more administrative buy-in beyond just allowing it to happen to gain the dedicated staffing resources that these programs require?
That's a big question, and there was a lot in there. So hopefully my fellow presenters will have some ideas as well. Yes, the program, I think, started as an outgrowth of an administrative body, the LGBTQ plus task force, which was started by faculty members. Service work, it's part of what I was hired to do. I teach information literacy, I serve as a librarian, I have service responsibilities, and I have professional development and publication presenting responsibilities. That's all part of being a faculty member. When programs start growing, ours is growing, we want it to get bigger. So we definitely do need administrative support from the college in making this grow. We have had, I guess, a level of sort of emotional support, that we know they're there. We get lots of kudos, but in terms of having somebody in, our student services department actually give us a paraprofessional who could do a lot of this administrative work that I've been doing, especially as we try to scale up to offering this on all 3 of our campuses. That's something that hopefully the task force is going to work on. And it is important. And I do understand the burnout factor. I also see it kind of from the point of view of a little bit, I feel like this is my baby, and it can be hard to give up and to delegate. And I know that I'm one of those people that struggles with that. I like to I know what's going on. I have it all organized. I don't have to depend on anyone else to get things done. Yes, that does eventually lead to burnout. Right now, we're small enough that it's still manageable, but finding that institutional support is really important. I do want to say really quickly that our LGBTQ task force draws from so many stakeholders, social justice stakeholders on our campus, including administrative stakeholders. So they are there, they are aware of the issue, and everybody's doing their best to try to grow this program in a way that will make it more sustainable than just having kind of one person doing all of the small details, as well as covering facilitation and training new facilitators and doing the big stuff as well. So it's a great question.
Thank you, Susan. Dina, Marissa, would either of you like to respond as well?
I have kind of a unique perspective on this one because I am a student and a student volunteer who, is on several different committees. And often the work does kind of fall to us as the volunteers, as student volunteers. I find that on a lot of these committees, the conversations, especially in equity, diversity, and inclusion, a lot of times it kind of goes in circles. And it's very difficult to really hold administration accountable at times. So I really don't know the answer to that question. I think a lot of it has to do with framing. And speaking one-on-one with and calling in administration to have these conversations around, trying to get buy-in. So I do think it's not an easy, quick fix. I think that it requires like a lot of persistence.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's very difficult to come up with these sort of solutions, but if I could just mention one organization that I would like to use as an example. So in the graduate school that I plan on attending for this fall, what really impressed me at their virtual open house was an entire 1-hour presentation on their new, let me look up the name, Inclusive Culture Committee. This was something formed in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, something that was demanded by the graduate student organization. And what they really emphasized was the quantitative way in which they wanted to reach their goals and the ways that they would hold themselves accountable. So they outlined the specific steps that they were going to take, including making application resources more accessible, being more vocal with anti-racist statements. And they mentioned some way of having the university administration hold them accountable to that, but they came up with the plans themselves. They also made the very specific choice of calling upon a cisgender white male professor to take the lead, which he graciously did, seeing that he seemed like a very socially conscious person. That's something that can take a lot of trust, but they did it with the express intent of what you mentioned, not having the same people giving the same kind of presentations, doing the same kind of organizing. So it's just an interesting example that I'm excited to see how it works when I attend there in the fall.
Thank you, Marissa. We have another question for Dina. Do you have suggestions for other departments trying to get started in incorporating anti-racist trainings?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different for every department. I think the most important piece is awareness building, really calling attention to the need for anti-racist training. And there are so many resources out there that can help to build that awareness. But building awareness is the first step. I would personally suggest going the photo voice route, using photos to really interpret and to really show what the need is, what the social issue is at hand, and what are some suggestions for change, can really help to raise awareness for folks and to get them thinking about potential change in a realm of different departments. It's not an easy conversation. And in fact, I have personally been pushing for anti-racist trainings for faculty and staff at the School of Social Welfare for over a year. There's been conversations about it, and it is actually finally happening this spring. And that is in the School of Social Welfare as social workers. So, it's not an easy fix. And even with anti-racist education and anti-racist programming, there is still going to be white supremacy embedded into the field. This is a long-term, this is really a long-term issue.
Thank you, Dina. And last question, we're running out of time. What would you do to counter the resistance for participation in these type of programs from select faculty and also higher up administration officials? How can we get them to participate?
Well, if I can start, I have a funny anecdote with this question. I asked the same kind of question at the American Physics Society Annual Leadership Conference. So all the best, brightest physics professors in the field, what was their answer to this question? And they really just said, well, you have to look at the bright side. They have to retire eventually. So I think there's something to, so that answer makes me laugh. but I think there's something to be said about, like, there's some people that have done their commitment to a field. They feel as if there's nothing more they can do. They don't want to change anything. So that's when I wonder when it becomes important to focus our efforts towards the new faculty, towards those who are more receptive to ideas, who would maybe more willing to listen before their opinions get formed by maybe some of those resistant faculty. So just in terms of balancing our efforts towards convincing those people and working on the people that we know are going to be the best allies in the future is, I think, something to consider.
Right. I like that point, Marissa. It's important to focus on who you can reach first, and then let that build outward organically. People talk, people see the Braver Spaces lapel pins and ask you about them. Again, administrators that we have on the LGBTQ task force have made it clear that at presidential cabinet meetings, they're talking up this program. So they're leading by example and saying you need to be a part of this as well. So it's that starting with where you can make an impact, and then hoping that it's going to sort of grow organically outward to other people who maybe weren't initially interested, but now that they know that their office mate did it, or that their department head has gone through the training, might start to see it in a different way and become interested in participating.
Yeah, just to quickly echo what Marissa and Susan just said, I think it really is about making a culture shift. It's around creating a culture of change. That is how you're going to get buy-in. That is how you're going to get participation up, is really through creating and fostering a, empathetic and welcoming environment of change. And that is what we're trying to do through the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee and the Racial Equity Student Alliance, is really trying to frame things in a way that's inviting, that's exciting for them to be a part of that change. There is some conversation around trying to incentivize students, like faculty and students, to get involved in these types of programs. But personally, I don't think it's about I don't like seeing it as incentivizing. I like seeing it as building a collective force for change.
Thank you again, Susan, Marissa, and Dina. This was a really great panel discussion. Again, I'm humbled to be part of this, and we will now be transitioning to lunch. So I apologize for taking a few minutes over, but thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you later this afternoon.